So today we're picking back up where we left off on symbolic interactionism, and we will be discussing some of the methods, some of the methods that you might use in symbolic interactionist research, their primary questions, and do a bit of comparing and contrasting with symbolic interactionism and other frameworks. But before we get started, some brief updates and reminders. Your first quiz is now graded with comments. For those of you who perhaps marked something incorrectly, I tried to provide you with information of where the correct answer could be found, or I asked some questions that might give you a better indication of what you could do in the future. And especially for the essay questions, make sure you are answering those questions and answering the full question. And then your first activity is due this Friday at 11:59 p.m. This is a reminder that when you are answering the questions for that activity, to make sure that you are answering them from a symbolic interactionist perspective, keeping in mind those macro level structures that are really a big focus for social psychology, like race, class, gender, religion, status, and so on. But again, make sure that you are answering from a symbolic interactionist perspective with consideration for those things. And what I think will help you a lot is watching the supplementary videos and making sure that you read the brief overview that's provided with the assignment. And that there will be no class next Monday. For those of you who do plan on attending class, it's a holiday, so of course none of us will be here. And then we'll pick back up for symbolic interactionism that Wednesday. And then the reading for next week will also be posted to Canvas within the next couple of days, and that will be posted under the Week 4 module. So, again, for those of you who aren't in person, I ask you to pause the video a couple times and think about these questions. But as a little activity to get you thinking about what sorts of research can be done with symbolic interaction and its importance and its value in terms of getting at meaning and symbols and that kind of really valuable information. So let's say hypothetically that a school assigns each student a set of folders. They're pre-labeled, one for each class, and they notice that students keep accidentally bringing the wrong folder to their classes. So to help resolve this issue, they ask us to figure out what's going on and to come up with some strategies that will improve their color-coded system. So one thing we might ask students, and I'll ask you all, is which folder is for science? And now, since the audio is messed up on the first video, and I'm recording this now after class, I can share with you a bit of what your classmates indicated. Most people agree that green is for science. A few students thought that maybe red was for science. But overall, there's a pretty strong consensus for green. And maybe that's because when we think of like eco-friendly things or things that are all natural, it's typically branded as green. In fact, if you're environmentally friendly, it's something that, or environmentally conscious, it's often labeled or marketed with associations with the color green. And so maybe that's why we think of science when we think of green. Or when we think of science, we often think of natural sciences like biology. And that may be more associated with green, like the color of nature. Some others are like, what color is math? And there was some mixed reviews, but I think by and large, a lot of people associate math with red or maybe even blue. And history could be, at least in my perspective, history is the yellow folder. It could never be the purple folder. That's just not history. And science could definitely never be purple. Purple's maybe for English. I don't know. But we each have different opinions on it. And although these opinions aren't based in fact necessarily, they feel so objectively true. And why is that? Why do we have strong associations with different subjects in school to different colored folders. And why do these colors and their respective school subjects, like I said, feel so objective even when they're not? And while this is not necessarily looking at an interaction, since individual behavior is group behavior, we are looking at the cultural associations between colors and school subjects. So for whatever reason, we have attached certain symbols to different school subjects, different color associations. And that in turn influences how well a group of students are able to remember which folder belongs to which class. These meanings are derived from experience, our interactions with others, and our interactions with society as a whole. One potential reason is, what are the color of our textbooks? When I think of history, I often think of more subdued colors, like a burnt orange or kind of a golden yellow, and it makes me think of something that's like antique, like brass. I don't know. History could even maybe be blue. I'm not sure, but when you think about maybe the color of textbooks and how those colors are often associated with those particular topics, and how every student is looking at similar textbooks at the same point in time, at the same ages, that's part of the way our culture and our society are conveying these messages to us about meaning and making these associations. Maybe, again, has to do with the symbols that are associated with things like math and science and English and history, and how that creates this kind of color association in our brain. And so, research using a symbolic interactionist frame, these are just some general assumptions that these research endeavors would entail. And these assumptions extend beyond those premises and assumptions of the framework itself. And these are specifically in terms of any research conducted with the symbolic interactionist frame. The first being, interaction is the basic unit of study, and that's incredibly important. Symbolic interaction is very much focused on interactions, period. That's the data that we want to get at. That's where meaning lies. Meaning is created and destroyed and recreated in interaction. And that could be an interaction of a person with the self. It could be between two people, or among a small group of people, or a person within an organization, or people with society and culture. Like the folder example, that again is not necessarily an interaction between individuals, but an interaction of these groups of individuals with their society, with their culture, and the meanings and associations that we have attached to different symbols and to language and to ideas and to topics. The second is that individuals are created through interaction, and that in turn society is created through interaction. So from this perspective, from a sociological, social psychology perspective, society creates individuals. It can influence our perception and our perspective and our values and beliefs and the ways in which we interact with others, but also that those interactions on the micro level between individuals is also shaping and building society. So it's this reciprocal process, that society isn't this static entity that just imposes its will on the people, but that through our interactions, we are also creating and shaping it every day, every moment. It's very dynamic. We're not two distinct entities. We are one living organism. And that we actually do not sense our environment directly. We define the situation, which results from ongoing interaction. And so again, with its roots in pragmatism, we are not necessarily defining the situation or perceiving the situation as it truly is. Because in that case, we are defining it based on our perception and the associations and we have attached to certain symbols, the meaning that we've attached to different symbols. And then finally, human action results from the present situation. and that past experiences play a role because we apply them to the definition of the present situation. And that sounds kind of odd when you say we're only looking at this present action and interaction. But of course, someone's past plays a role in their present experience, but we're not making assumptions about the past. We're not looking at the past. We don't know what happened. We weren't there. We can only look at the present situation and assume that their past experiences are playing a role in their current and present interpretation. Used from this frame, first and foremost, highlights that meaning is a fundamental component of human and society interaction. So the majority of interactionist research uses qualitative research methods to study aspects of social interaction. These methods allow researchers to access symbols and meaning, and they argue that close contact is necessary for understanding the meaning of actions, the definition of the situation, and the processes through which actors construct the situation within an interaction. And this means that researchers believe that you have to get close to a community, you have to get close to those with whom you're working, and you have to understand the specialized language and the rules of interaction, like what you can say, when you can say it, and how you can say it, and how that differs according to the culture of the group or community that you're working with. So some of the methodology might be ethnography or discourse analysis, phenomenological research, and even sometimes experimental research. And the methods that are often employed could be participant observation, interviews, focus groups, content analysis. So one example for a focus group would be like you say you're going into a community and they have needs that they would like to address. And you want to send out a survey and ask people questions about the community. Well, first, you might want to conduct some focus groups with key leaders from that community. And when you're in a focus group, you're not there to impose your own, preconceived notions about their needs and their wants. You're not there to impose your own biases on the situation. You're simply there to listen and to understand where they're coming from, what they truly want, what it really means, its significance, and the important symbols within that community. And you're just there to listen and to understand the meaning of these interactions, of these symbols and relationships, and make sure so that you can make sure that comes across well in the survey, so that it's a survey that is relevant to the community members it intends to serve. And so that's one way you could use symbolic interactionism as a way to shape research. It's not necessarily the end in itself, but it's a way to make sure that the work that you're doing is relevant for those with whom you're working. You could also do an interview, which, you could do multiple interviews and transcribe that and employ a variety of methods to get at meaning, and so on. But the thing that is stressed the most is that interaction is important, but that you have to be somewhat involved and entrenched in that community for you to even begin to understand really the gravity and the significance of these different symbols. And again, symbols are like language and ideas and actual objects and so on. And so here we have some research questions, or rather a description of these research questions, some of their characteristics, what you would see in questions using a symbolic interactionist framework. They seek to explain, describe, or explore a social phenomena. They focus on interactions and processes, and observations in the real world raise additional questions. And so going back to what we were talking about in the previous slide is that a symbolic interactionist framework doesn't always intend or at least research using that framework, doesn't intend to necessarily always be a means to an end, like to solve the problem itself, but more so to provide additional information that is useful in developing solutions and strategies to solve complex problems in innovative ways. And so one example might be like the word student, and what a student means to a teacher may be different than what student means to a room full of students. And so this difference in meaning and expectation can certainly create some friction in that relationship. It can create some conflict because communication in terms of like the meaning associated with that role are very different. And so let's say to a teacher, being a student means coming into the classroom excited to learn, ready to learn. You want to hone your craft and your skill, and you're there to learn new things and come up with new ideas and challenge yourself in new and interesting ways, and that you're diligent, you are prepared, you're excited to learn, excited to work, and all that good stuff. And then, but for a student, like perhaps like they see their role as, showing up to class like you're supposed to, taking notes, completing assignments, following directions, submitting your work, and getting a grade, and it's over and done with, which is fine. But it's just that those differences in expectations can create conflict because you're not necessarily meeting each other's expectations. And that goes the same for students and their expectations for their instructors. Are they meeting your expectations? Because what it means to be a teacher and what it means to be a student are different for different people. And so using a symbolic and interactionist framework to address this issue isn't going to necessarily give you a solution to the problem, but it can certainly provide you with additional information to help you come up with strategies and solutions to that problem. Or maybe it will lead you to further research, but it will at least put you in the right direction to see where the disconnects are. Or maybe help you to better reframe what that means for one or both sides, to get everyone on the same page about like their expectations and what it means to be a student or what it means to be a teacher through their eyes. And so here are some examples, some research examples from a symbolic interactionist standpoint, but also since we don't have any social psychology theories that we've discussed yet that I can use to compare and contrast, I'm going to go ahead and use psychology as a reference. And so we'll kind of compare maybe what research might look like from a symbolic interactionist, using a symbolic interactionist framework and social psychology versus if that same study were done in psychology. So the first example is online identity and how identity is constructed online. So a social psychological perspective might ask, like, what strategies do people use to construct their online identities? Are they drawing from their roles, maybe as a parent, as a friend, as a student? And how are they trying to convey status? And what sorts of things convey or communicate like that higher status? And what does it tell us about society? Because again, if we're taking it from a social psychological standpoint, we're interested in not just like that person's view of themselves and how they are trying to communicate like who they are online, but they're also anticipating how others are going to react to the things that they post and things that they say. And so what sorts of things do they anticipate people valuing or perceiving as being cool or interesting or, whatever the case may be, however they're trying to portray themselves? But if this were done in psychology, perhaps we might look at like the number of likes and the types of interactions you have online and how that influences a person's identity. So their sense of self, their confidence, their esteem, and their competence. or their perceived competence. A second example is exploring how communities are constructed online and how discourse develops. And community, this is one of my favorite areas of social psychology, is community and how communities form and how they sustain and what sorts of people are drawn to these communities. But for this particular example, we might say, are they coming together on common goals, common values, interests, beliefs, and what sorts of people are drawn to these communities? Whereas if it were in psychology, perhaps they might look into why individuals seek out these online communities. Are they looking for support? Are they looking to share their experiences? So this is a cathartic experiment. It's a way of coping, perhaps. Or are they looking for like validation of their experience or their identity, their interests, or whatever the case may be. A third example is that of stigma. And so from a social psychological standpoint, we might look at how stigma shapes help-seeking behaviors. So we might say, how does their internalized stigma shape their perceptions of how others will react to them sharing their experience? Let's say with like mental illness. So their expectations of if they will be rejected or their experience will be, dismissed or devalued in some way. How does that internalized stigma, influence their perceptions of how others will react? And then how then does that shape their help-seeking behavior, their willingness to reach out, or their propensity to withdraw and self-isolate? If this were in psychology, they might look at how experiences of things related to stigma, so like actual experiences of like discrimination or devaluation or rejection, how then does that shape their own perception of mental illness, of their own mental health? And so, how then does that shape like how stigmatized that is for them? And so we might then start out with like help-seeking behaviors. They actually experience something that is related to stigma, like devaluation or rejection. And then how does that shape their view of their own mental health? And so the differences are a little bit more subtle in this example, but again, from a social psychological perspective, we're interested in how their perception of how others will react. So how does that internalized stigma influence their perception? And then how does that perception and anticipation of like rejection influence their willingness or ability to reach out and seek help? And then finally, this example I don't have an example from psychology for, but it's about power dynamics. And I think it's a really interesting area where you will see some work, some symbolic interactionist frameworks at play. And it's examining how relationships of power are demonstrated in historical text. And so they will tediously go through these texts and first and foremost ask, like, who is speaking? Like, whose perspective is this coming from? And just as an example, and of course this doesn't necessarily mean anything by itself, but when you see a pattern emerge and it's in combination with other things, it can tell us a lot about those power dynamics within those relationships. And so let's say we are looking at one person is speaking. How do they describe themselves in relation to others? And how do they describe others in relation to themselves? So if they're talking about their significant other and they're always saying like, my partner, my girlfriend, my boyfriend, my, whoever, my this, my that. And we might say, okay, they're expressing some sort of ownership over this person. They're not referring to them by their name. It's not giving them a sense of identity or individuality. It's only in relation to this person, and this person demonstrating like possession of them in some way in this relationship. And so again, that doesn't necessarily mean anything by itself, but when you see that emerge as a pattern in combination with other things, it can be really important. And what this does is it allows us to reevaluate some of these historical texts. And often it can tell a very different story when you're taking into account who is telling the story and their perspective and how they viewed themselves in relation to the people that they're talking about or to the situation that they're talking about. And very often it can tell a very different story, or at least the same story, but from a very different perspective. And so you start to see those dynamics emerge and how they shape not just history, but how they shape discourse over time. And so that's a really interesting area where you will see a lot of symbolic and interactionist frameworks at play. And so moving on, and again, I assume most of you are not going to go on to conduct research in more formal settings like in a lab or in a research institution, but I want you to know that this is something that you can employ in your own life. And it doesn't have to be formal or some formalized process. It can just be little experiments or ways of examining the world that provide you with new and interesting insight into different social phenomena. And so this in particular revolves around taste. And do you have good taste? And that can be more generally, maybe you just have good taste in everything. Or maybe you have good taste in music, or good taste in art, or food, or, clothing, or whatever the case may be. And would you be able to tell the difference between something that is higher quality and something that's lower quality, and what's considered good? And if you were unable to attend class in person, I encourage you to click on the link in the PDF version of the slides, or you could just search on YouTube right now, Joshua Bell Subway or Metro Station. And so if you took the time to watch that, it's a very short video, and it just shows a man playing a violin, and he's actually playing in a Washington, D.C. metro station. And this was a little social experiment that was designed to give us more insight about what's considered good taste, and it told us a lot about our culture and people's values and so on. But he played for about 45 minutes, and in that time there were over 1,000 people. This was during the morning rush hour. Over 1,000 people passed him, and before they began the study, they assumed that maybe about 100 people would stop and listen. But after the 45 minutes, only 27 people had stopped, and most of them just stopped briefly. But unbeknownst to them, the person playing the violin was this world-famous musician, playing an instrument that is valued at something like $3.5 million, and he's playing an incredibly difficult piece, but nobody noticed. And why is that? So this brings up an important point, something that's crucial for symbolic interactionism, and that's defining the situation. When individuals encounter one another, they seek out information about the other to define the nature of the interaction. They look at things like setting, clothing, and where someone is positioned in relation to everything in that environment. And so you can see kind of in this picture, he's actually standing near the waste bins and a recycling bin. And there's actually a sign behind him. It's a place designated for smoking, I believe. But of course, there was no one smoking near him. But people were just passing by. And he's wearing, just this baseball cap and this normal cotton t-shirt. And he's, playing away. And everybody's just going about their normal day. And so they're picking up on what he's wearing, and they assume that he's playing for money. And so morning commuters use that information around them to define the situation. The interaction between themselves and the violinist, including the fact that the musician is playing in a subway station, wearing everyday clothing, and standing kind of in the corner next to these waste bins with an open violin case. So people assumed he was playing for money, and I think he actually earned like maybe $32 after the 45 minutes. But despite his talent and professional status, given this information, the majority of commuters defined this situation as an amateur musician playing for money, and they ignored him. Had the situation been defined differently, however, like a sign saying, world-renowned violinist is going to play an impromptu concert today, perhaps more people would have stopped. And in fact, they did a few years later when he played at that same metro station, and they had announced it, and tons and tons and tons of people showed up. They were so excited to listen to him play. And so we look at these different symbols that are communicating to people what the situation is and how they should interact with the people around them. And how are these symbols tied to status? And so, how might you expect a professional musician to dress? And where might you expect a professional musician to perform? And to whom do you expect a professional musician to perform? Well, you might expect him to be wearing something much more formal, maybe designer, at the very least well-fitting, perhaps even tailored to him. You wouldn't expect him to play in a subway station. You expect him to play in a concert hall or a place that is specifically designed to accommodate his instrument and others. And certainly, the people who might attend these events are attending because they enjoy listening to the performance. And so, I want you to think about how these symbols are tied to status, and not just these symbols, but others that we see in our everyday life. And what do they tell us? What do they communicate to us about a person's status? And this brings us to another point on what defines good taste. Some would say that good taste is a reflection of the taste of the ruling classes, demarcated by ruling class signifiers. And so again, looking here at this picture, the setting, clothing, and the audience are much different. He's wearing something, much more formal. He's in a setting that you're more accustomed to seeing. You would be accustomed to seeing him in. And the audience presumably is there because they paid to be there, because they appreciate his performance and what he's producing as an artist, as well as the other performers on stage. But when we look at this setting compared to the last, and we're thinking about how that symbolizes and communicates status, in the previous setting, he was playing in a non-elite space, wearing non-elite clothing, and playing to a non-elite audience. So that's why the commuters were unable to recognize the highly skilled nature of his performance and his ability. And this demonstrates how good taste can be understood as a social phenomenon rather than an objective truth. This also demonstrates how something like good taste is also a classed phenomenon. It's more than just a social phenomenon. We would say that it is a classed phenomenon because these things can be associated with class. And so how are these symbols tied to class? What symbols specifically are tied to class and communicate information that can tell us a lot about someone's class status? And that's something I want you to think about, particularly before we return to class for Wednesday. It's something we'll discuss in greater depth. But in the meantime, I want you to think about these different status and class indicators that you see in everyday life and what sorts of information they contain and meaning they communicate. And so, speaking of class and status indicators, I saw this quote and I thought it was perfect for what we were discussing. It says, "It is good taste and good taste alone that possesses the power to sterilize and is always the first handicap to any creative functioning." And so, as Joshua Bell was performing, despite his professional status, nobody noticed or seemed to care. They didn't notice the skill of his performance. They didn't think about the passion and the time and the commitment and the years and years of practice that it takes to reach that level, because of the clothes he was wearing and the venue where he was performing. It didn't communicate those things to them. It didn't draw their attention in a way that communicated that this is something of higher value, of good quality. So as Dolly is referencing to here, believing that you have good taste can be a limitation to recognizing something of quality and value, because what we define as good is tied to symbols that communicate worth. But how does this translate to the classroom, where teachers judge their students, make judgments about their students and treat them accordingly? Or on the playground, where children judge each other and treat each other according to those judgments? Or what about when you're applying for a job? So in the workplace, when you're applying for a job, when you're asking for a raise, or in healthcare, how does it translate to places like, in the bank, when you're trying to get a loan, when you're moving to a new neighborhood or trying to choose a new neighborhood, or in the courtroom, in other places? How do these micro-level interactions create macro-level patterns, resulting in certain groups being treated unfairly or unjustly? And how then do these macro-level patterns in turn influence micro-level interactions? Because again, society and culture isn't just influencing us as individuals. Our interactions on the micro level are also creating society, because individuals and society aren't these totally separate, distinct entities. We're all part of one living organism. It's a system, and it's constantly in flux. It's dynamic. And the interactions we're having on the micro level go on to shape what's going on the macro level. And what's going on in the macro level then influences our behaviors and our interactions on the micro level. And that's something we're going to discuss more Wednesday in terms of class and the utility of using a symbolic interactionist framework when discussing things like class and status indicators. But other than that, that's all for today. Please don't forget to watch the supplementary videos for this week and complete Activity 1. Thanks.